Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We are continuing our succession of high-level international economic policymakers, giving us their views on the issues of the day and the longer-term concerns they have. We're very honored today to be hosting Vice President Nadia Calviño, who is not only Vice President, but also Minister for Economy and Digitalization for Spain. And she is, of course, also critically this week and for the foreseeable future, the chair of the IMFC. Vice President Calviño has agreed to discuss economic and policy prospects to meet the current and future challenges. She'll be making some opening remarks, I believe, on that topic, and then we'll be having an on-the-record free discussion. We are very excited to be welcoming Vice President Calviño for the first time officially to the Peterson Institute. She has been the first Vice President of Spain since July of last year and chair of the IMFC since January of this year, and congratulations to her on taking up that public service role in a very difficult period. Previously, she's held the position for Minister for Economy and Digitalization since 2018, and she remains in that role. Prior to her appointment to the ministerial level, she held other senior roles within the Ministry for the Economy. Ms. Calviño has also served in senior positions in several directorates general at the European Commission, where I had met her several years ago, including as Director General of the EU budget from 2014 to 2018. She holds degrees in economics and law and is in fact lectured at the Faculty of Economics at the Universidad Complutense of Madrid, which is much more famous than my pronunciation allows. We are always pleased, just as we were to welcome Thomas Jordan this morning, to welcome economic policymakers who combine thoughtful research and teaching with their active policy role, as Vice President Calviño does. Madam Vice President, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for this very kind introduction, and thanks to the Institute for this invitation. I think it is a great pleasure to be back in Washington. Unfortunately, we were not able to have this debate in person. I hope we can repeat the same discussion in the premises so that we can have a more of a touch and feel experience with the different persons joining us today. But I am glad we didn't miss this opportunity of the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank to have an exchange on current challenges, the economic outlook, and some of the top priorities for policymakers these days. I will share with you some introductory remarks, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you have got from the audience and the members of the Institute in the meantime. Basically, I'll just focus on two issues. Where are we and where are we heading towards? What is the outlook and what can be the way forward? As you said in your kind introduction, this is my first meeting as chair of the IMFC, that, as you all probably know, is the advisory council of the IMF. This is where the ministers and central bank governors of the member countries of the IMF gather twice a year to provide guidance, to provide an orientation, a roadmap for the policies of the fund. Now, obviously, this meeting is taking place at a very particular moment, a watershed moment in many instances and from many points of view, and that is, where are we? You know, what's going on right now? Because for the last 2 years, we've been confronted with an unprecedented crisis. That's the pandemic. I will not dwell much on that. I will say just a couple of words on the outcome and the way out of that crisis. But on top of that one, we are now suffering a different kind of crisis, which has been provoked by the attack on Ukraine, and which is having a very significant impact, leading actually the IMF today to revise downwards their growth forecast for the whole of the world, and to revise upwards the inflation forecast for the world. So after many years where the concern was deflation, actually inflation is back in fashion as a key concern for policymakers. And this is creating yet again challenges that are novel to many of us, that we haven't lived for many decades, and which require decisive action on the side of the different countries. And I will here do a spoiler with regards to the conclusion. I am convinced it requires global coordinated response, and thus multilateral institutions must play a key role in providing a reply to these challenges which go beyond the national boundaries. So we were confronted with the pandemic, but we provided a very different response to the financial crisis that broke in 2008. We coordinated our economic policies in the context of the G20, also the IMF, World Bank, and all the other financial institutions played an important role. The European Union responded united in a coordinated manner with short-term responses, but also a mid to long-term unprecedented investment and reform plan. And this has enabled us to protect the economic tissue, to protect jobs, to protect the income of households, of families, by ensuring that the public sector was cushioning and avoiding an increase of leverage of the private sector. This is a very different response to the one that was provided to the financial crisis. And this enabled us to have a very fast exit, a strong growth in a record time as compared to previous crises. Spain is a good example at hand, because we have experienced a strong recovery since the middle of last year. The recovery and growth prospect was very positive beginning of this year. We have had an extraordinary evolution of the labor market, also thanks to the labor market reform we implemented as of 1st of January. And so the forecast was quite positive in terms of growth this year. And then came the attack on Ukraine, which has been prepared for a while and has been leading to higher energy prices, together with a strong recovery in some jurisdictions and bottlenecks in international supply chains. These is, as I was saying, a second crisis that comes on top of the pandemic, which has not disappeared. You know this very well here in the US, but we're seeing these days how China is actually having a very significant lockdown in its largest city, Shanghai, which certainly is also going to have an impact, again, a negative impact on international supply chains and on growth more broadly. So overall, this is creating a very significant challenge, leading to bottlenecks in food supply and food supply concerns in most vulnerable countries, leading to higher energy and other raw materials prices. And as I said at the beginning, inflation is a serious concern for many countries. Now, where are we heading towards? What does the future look like? And I think the most important lesson we've learned from the reply to the pandemic is the future is not written. This is not new. We all know this very well, but it's worth remembering every once in a while. It depends on what we do. It depends on the decisions we take now. It depends on the policy decisions and implementation we deploy to respond to this challenge. And I think the reaction to the pandemic has given us some lessons that are valuable when trying to address the rest of the short-term challenges. First of all, coordination is better than lack of coordination, and so a divergence in terms of the policies that are implemented. And here, obviously, our spring meetings are going to be quite important in coordinating our actions right now. Coordination in fiscal policies, monetary policies, but also trying to provide a coordinated response in areas which are normally not tackled by finance ministers, but which have become our top priorities in the last years. This is health, responding to the pandemic. This is food supply. This is also energy prices and energy market performance and evolution. So it is extremely important that we do this, that we coordinate our response if we want to be effective when faced with global challenges. A second lesson I think we learned is that it is cheaper and more effective to try to prevent something being destroyed than then having to rebuild from scratch. Of course, since we're talking about a war which is terribly destructive and is having a terrible impact on citizens just very close to the EU border, it's difficult to say this. But nevertheless, it's better to prevent than to react. So we need to provide a shock response right now without losing sight of our midterm objectives. This explains that many countries have implemented some short-term measures, Spain too, to cushion, to protect the most vulnerable groups of our societies in the wake of this price spike in energy, to provide a transition for companies, also to try to bring down energy prices, and to accelerate investment and deploying of renewables. This is a very important point because when this kind of situation arises, there may be some that think, oh, we're wrong to push ahead with the green transition. Actually, this is very costly, this is not so urgent, and we have to rethink our targets. Well, our approach, and I think this is the approach of the EU, and I think it is also the approach of the majority of members of the international community that will gather here this week. Our approach is one where we should press ahead and accelerate the green transition. It has become even more urgent than ever to accelerate the deployment of renewables, electricity and energy storage, energy efficiency, new technologies that provide us with clean production and industries going forward. So this requires acting on the short term in an effective manner, but without losing sight to this mid to long term objective. Which brings me to my final point. We have to, and it has to do also with the pandemic, lesson learned from the pandemic. If we want to be effective and sustainable in the mid to long run, we need to protect fairness and try to avoid that inequalities increase beyond countries and within our own countries. During the pandemic, at least those countries that had the financial capacity to do so, we have tried to protect employment and to protect the most vulnerable part of our society. And this is key to have a strong recovery and a fair way out. Well, right now, we need to think about fairness too. Fairness with regards to the different sectors of the economy, intergenerational fairness. We need to think about future generations. We cannot lose sight of the need to leave them with a green, sustainable environment where they can also develop their lives and fulfill their hopes and expectations. Also fairness in the sense of supporting the most vulnerable countries that are confronted with not only the green transition and digitalization, but also financial stability challenges and more traditional emerging countries kind of challenges. And in this regard, I think that the work that we will be doing this week to reinforce our multilateral safety net with the deployment of the new sustainability trust, not only for low-income countries, also for middle-income countries, to try to provide funding for this green transition, as well as the work we will be doing to reinforce the debt relief mechanisms that we have been building for the past 2 years. All these elements are crucial if we want to ensure that we reach our goals, which are global goals, and therefore require that all countries advance, maybe at different rhythms, but that nobody is left behind, because we will otherwise not achieve this more sustainable and inclusive growth that is the leitmotif and the key objective that we have in the mid to long run. So these are my three main reflections on the current situation, the challenges we are facing. I said before, we are at a watershed moment from a geopolitical point of view. Also from an economic policy point of view, monetary policy is faced with very interesting challenges and trade-offs right now. Likewise with fiscal policy, geopolitical equilibria are obviously being put to the test right now. Likewise, we need to press ahead with the green transition that was important before. It's becoming more urgent right now, also from the point of view of strategic security and sustainability of our economic systems for the future. So it is a quite interesting moment to be having these meetings in Washington and meeting again in person, and being therefore, I hope, able to prove once more that the multilateral system that has guided us since the end of since the mid of the 20th century is probably the best tool that we have, and one that we should reinforce going forward if we wanted also to succeed in the years ahead, which are surely going to be bringing about very significant challenges and changes to the world we leave behind. Thank you for the invitation again, and happy to have a conversation, a debate with you, and respond to your questions.
Thank you, Vice President Calviño. The breadth of your vision of what needs to be dealt with at this, as you put it, watershed moment is impressive and frankly necessary. So thank you for taking up the gavel virtually of IMFC chairman, in addition to your other responsibilities. Let me try to draw you out a bit more on some of the priority issues you identified. Let's start on climate change. So the G20 finance ministries, anyone with any conscience or evidence base knows we have to respond to climate change, in particular by raising prices on carbon and by green investment, public and private. Yet the current energy price shock due to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is being responded to by a lot of countries, at least initially, including the US, with talk of subsidies, energy tax cuts, things to offset the price shock. How do we get the current policies reconciled with the need for longer term policies to encourage the transition, diminish demand for fossil fuels, and so on? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, yes, this is an extremely pertinent question, and one where which I think all countries are currently confronted with. All countries on the demand side of the energy market are confronted with right now. In the short term, in the short run, we had to react to this shock. Obviously, the geopolitical shock created by the invasion of Ukraine, and as I said a moment ago, this has been building up for some time. Actually, the Spanish energy market is particularly reactive. There is an overweight of the price of gas in the wholesale market, which immediately trickles down to the retail market, and that is also overweight in our general price index, which meant that since last summer, we already identified that something was going on, and we were worried about energy price increases. At that time, not so many people were worried about it. Unfortunately, some months later, now everybody realizes that the war was being prepared and that we need to indeed react. Now, on the in the immediate reaction, we have had to cushion the blow on most vulnerable industries, energy-intensive industries, gas-intensive industries, as well as most vulnerable citizens and sectors that were most affected by the rise in oil prices, transport, road transport, etc. As an immediate reaction to try to avoid that this shock would have a massive economic impact also in the recovery underway. But these measures are not sustainable from a fiscal point of view, and they are obviously not desirable from an economic policy point of view. We should learn the lessons of the 70s. I think we're all aware that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in the mid-run, our objectives should be clear. We have to accelerate the green transition. And that is why, together with the sort of shock reaction, short-term reaction, which in the case of Spain has been targeted to, or our objective is to end it by June the 30th. So it's really a very short-term measures. We have in parallel accelerated all the procedures for the deployment of renewables. all the procedures for the deployment of the massive investment and reform program, so that we can also accelerate the solution to this situation, these vulnerabilities, which is reducing dependency on CO2 emitting energy sources. And that, I think, is the only sort of possible way forward right now. What I think is very important is that we renew our commitment to this green transition and try to accelerate it in the meetings we're holding this week. And so far, what I've heard is a very strong commitment on the side of the members in this direction. So there are no doubts as to the direction that we need to travel. There is no doubt that we need to accelerate our speed in that direction. And we will have to deal with the transition in a manner which is as fair as possible, bringing citizens with us, so that there is not a social backlash against this deep transformation of our economic structure.
It is a deep, sustained transformation to make. You interestingly mentioned the lessons of the 1970s, and I want to take you back to that for a moment with your hat on, speaking about fiscal policy. That, as you mentioned, and I strongly agree, we took broadly the right approach in response to COVID in terms of fiscal activism in a way we did not during the global financial crisis 12 years earlier. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I take it you're saying that, and that's what I would say. I fear your screen is frozen, so I will just try to continue. How should the finance ministers, the IMFC, and others be thinking about discretionary fiscal policy now? Should the lesson be we have to be ready to do large fiscal interventions like we did for COVID? Should the lesson be we've got to get back to discipline? What role do fiscal rules like those in the European Union or in the Euro area have in setting fiscal policy? And again, Vice President, it looks like you're frozen. I'm hoping we can get that resolved. Please bear with us. I'm assuming the Spanish embassy will be right back with us with Vice President Calviño. A technical issue. If we were in person, we could have avoided that. Hi, welcome back. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
So I was just asking you, you had earlier mentioned about learning the lessons from the 70s, but you also indicated us avoiding the errors that were made in response to global financial crisis. This is both under the heading of fiscal policy. So where do you think fiscal policy should be going from here? Should we be prepared for further discretionary large fiscal impulses like we did in response to COVID? Should we be imposing discipline now? What role does fiscal rules like those of the European Union play in your mind going forward?
Yes. Thank you very much. There was a technical problem, so back here. This is one of those very substantive debates that should not be left aside. In particular, in the case of the EU, I think the situation is very different between the US and the EU. and that's why actually a couple of weeks ago, we presented a joint paper with the Netherlands on the review of the European fiscal rules. And this, I think, was a very important development, first because of the substance, because we were calling on our colleagues to proceed and to make progress with the review of the fiscal rules. And we were also encouraging the European Commission to come forward with a concrete proposal. But maybe more importantly, the fact that the Netherlands and Spain were signing together a paper was in itself a strong message, because traditionally the Netherlands has been associated with a very specific approach in one corner, let me put it this way, of fiscal rules. And Spain was also traditionally associated with a group of countries that maybe were having in the past high deficits or high debt levels. And so the fact that we were joining our forces, I think, signals that we are at the moment where unity must be one of the guiding principles for our actions, where we have to focus on what's important, and we're all in the same boat here. We need to decide together how we're going to undertake the massive investments which are needed for these green and digital transitions. We have to decide together how to give ourselves a fiscal framework that ensures fiscal responsibility and discipline, and therefore long-term sustainability, whilst ensuring allowing or without endangering strong growth, job creation, and obviously these strategic investments for the future. This, I think, should be the right approach, ensuring fiscal sustainability, whilst at the same time ensuring that we can face the challenges of today and, more importantly, the challenges of the future. Let me add just one final point on the intergenerational fairness. The response to the pandemic, and you just said it, the massive fiscal response. The response to the pandemic has led all countries to a higher debt to GDP ratio as compared to 3 years ago. All European countries have higher debt to GDP levels. Fortunately, due to the strong growth in the case of Spain, for example, we have already started to absorb the extra debt generated by the response to the pandemic. But we need to make sure that right now we make the right decisions for future generations, so that there is not an additional burden on them and a limited fiscal space for them to make their own decisions when they are responsible for making economic policy decisions. And that is why I think it is crucial that we act in a responsible manner with regards to future generations. But that right now also means making the right investments that ensure this green transition and the digital transformation that provides them with more and better opportunities for the future.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Thank you for getting right back on the microphone after the technical interruption. If I could now, I'd like to speak to you in your role as chair of the IMFC. Okay. What role do you want the IMFC and the IMF to play now in the aftermath of Russia's invasion and the sanctions? Obviously, it's very difficult in a body where Russia and its allies have votes. Can the IMFC avoid being split or paralyzed? And just sort of looking forward, obviously, China and the US are starting to have differing approaches to the IMF and to the international financial system. How can the IMFC and the international community work through these things? You're muted, I'm sorry.
So we're obviously meeting at a particularly challenging time from this point of view. I really hope that we're working very hard to have a meaningful discussion in the upcoming meetings, because I think, as I said a moment ago, it's important to support our multilateral system. And there are very important challenges which are crucial to some countries around the world. which have to do with financial stability, which have to do with economic stability, with the strength of the recovery. It has to do, they have to do with many food security, and all these issues need to be tackled in a coordinated manner. So I do hope that and the initial messages, are positive in the sense of the vast majority of countries want to have meaningful discussions and useful outcomes of the meetings this week. But we have to be aware that indeed it is a particularly challenging situation, and we're working very hard and closely with the other countries and with the IMF staff to try to succeed in having, as I was saying, a meaningful discussion and a useful gathering this week.
I know you and your colleagues are working very hard at that. Can you say a bit more, leaving aside, as one must for the moment, the issue of Russia's participation and directly related issues to the conflict, to Russia's invasion? What are some of the agenda items that you wish the IMFC would move forward? Or putting it differently, had we had this conversation in December or start of January before Russia invaded Ukraine, what would you have wanted to be the agenda items for the IMFC to successfully take up?
Well, I think in the two related issues, and that you have already mentioned, actually both, our target for this meeting was to get the Sustainability and Resilience Trust up and running. Fortunately, the agreement was reached last week, and so I think that's already an outcome that we will have this week. And it is an important facility for low and middle income countries to be able to have a stronger financial situation to undertake the necessary investments for the green transition, amongst others. So that is already an important outcome. Secondly, I think it will be important if we can also reinforce the mechanisms we have to deal with most indebted and vulnerable countries throughout the world. The general approach has provided to be extremely useful in the last 2 years to provide debt relief to those countries with a more unstable financial situation. And that, I think, is again, an important issue that we surely will be talking about during this week, on top of the rest of the issues in the IMF agenda, and right now very focused on protecting financial stability throughout the world. And beyond these more short-term issues, I think the green agenda and pursuing and driving forward this agenda in all our international meetings, be it the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, having these on the table is a must. And I think also there is an increasing number of countries that see this as a top priority that should be dealt with also in these international fora, without losing sight of the different roles that the different institutions play in this multilateral framework.
Thank you. I am going to push you further than probably is fair, because your job is to chair the group and be realistic and get things forward. And as you mentioned, there are two very serious forms of progress. But we're all aware the World Bank leadership, the IMF leadership have made very clear that the successive blows of COVID and lack of provision of vaccines and cutoffs of tourism and remittances from migrating workers, all now followed by food and energy price shocks. This is potentially disastrous for parts of the developing world. You mentioned the already taken measures of debt relief and special facilities, which of course I commend. But thinking bigger picture, is there something wrong with our governance of the international financial institutions that we can't seem to get out ahead of these things? You said earlier, prevention is better than cure. Or is this just inevitably, inherently in a system of nation states, we can't really get out in front of these miseries for the poor, for the developing world? Sorry to be so cosmic, but we ask.
Well, no, you know, when the pandemic broke, I told myself, well, if the G20 hadn't existed, we would have to create it now. Fortunately, as a response to the previous financial crisis, the G20 was up and running and provided us with a very good forum to discuss beyond the IMF, beyond the World Bank and other institutions. Right now, I do think we have a quite solid multilateral framework to provide for a coordinated response. But there are very different points of view and there are very different priorities throughout the world. And this is the reality, no? So I think one has to be pragmatic and make the best of what we have. My experience during, in particular, these last 2 years is that multilateral institutions and formal and informal institutions have been actually up to the task. And we have undertaken unprecedented decisions, very significant decisions like the SDR issuance, extraordinary allocation last year, like the recovery plan in Europe, obviously the investment plan also here in the US, and some other very significant decisions that maybe would have been unimaginable, you know, some years ago. And international coordination has certainly encouraged this kind of decisions and changes and plans, which are what we need also going forward. So I remain optimistic in the sense of thinking that our systems have proven to be flexible and have evolved to match the challenges. And I see a strong determination on most countries to continue in the same vein.
Thank you very much. That's a very effective reply to my blue sky question, and I appreciate it. If I could, let me shift briefly back to Spain, because I know that many of our viewers rightly view this as an opportunity to get your perspective to an English language global audience on the Spanish economy, where you are Minister of the Economy and Digitalization. So you mentioned that you feel Spain has been recovering reasonably well from the COVID shock. So what do you see as some of the main remaining challenges for the Spanish economy? And at the national level, what policies are you undertaking to address them? In international comparison, what should we be thinking about Spain's unique position and progress?
Well, I have to say, I mean, the reason why I think the recovery has been extraordinary, despite the fact that Spain had one of the largest GDP drops due to the weight of tourism and also the lockdown, actually the recovery has been much faster and stronger than in previous crises. We have seen, just to give you three very significant examples, the job market. We have recovered employment and unemployment levels, not pre-COVID, but pre-financial crisis of 2008. So the number of people having jobs right now is higher than we had lived since, registered since 2008. Likewise, when we look at the number of indefinite contracts, which provide much more job stability, the share right now is about 30% of the contracts made in March, which is 3 times what we used to have before the labor market reform. So the job market is recovering very strongly compared to what happened after the financial crisis, which took 10, 12 years for the employment levels to be recovered. Likewise, tax income has allowed us, a very good performance has allowed us to reduce the deficit and debt levels faster than we had anticipated. And investment levels have recovered very strongly in Spain. And this is compared to 6 years where investment dropped after the financial crisis. So the way out of this pandemic crisis has been quite the opposite to what we lived after the financial crisis, which was a lost decade in many instances. And that, I think, is thanks to the short-term response, the European response to protect rather than let something be destroyed and have to build from scratch, as I said a moment ago. And then the second, I think, very different feature is the investment plan. The European Next Generation EU program, which will mobilize, as you know, around 700 billion euros. In the case of Spain, we will be mobilizing up to 140 billion euros. This is an unprecedented amount of investment. And this has already allowed us since 2020 to accelerate our reform program and to start an investment plan, which is already creating very different expectations on the side of the private sector and explains the recovery of investment, not only private, also public investment already in 2021. And this is allowing the country to launch strategic programs to accelerate the green transition, to accelerate the transformation of the car manufacturing industry. You may not know this, Spain is the second car manufacturer in Europe after Germany and exporter. So it is existential and strategically unavoidable that there is the transformation towards a green industry that builds the electric cars of the future. Likewise, in the area, in many other strategic areas for the country, agro-food industry, artificial intelligence, where we want also Spanish to be one relevant language in the development of these new technologies. So we have identified a number of strategic programs that we're going to be projects that we are already launching, thanks to this investment support coming from the EU budget. And likewise with reforms, we have already implemented structural reforms, for example, in labor market, also in the public sector, education, vocational training, which should have an impact in terms of increasing the size of companies, productivity, and potential growth in the country. And we're already starting to see the positive impact. So before the war started, we were foreseeing a very, very strong growth this year and a transformational process. And we should not move away from this path because this is what the country needs. So we are providing a short-term response to try to mitigate the possible negative impact of the in particular price spike. That's the most direct impact in the Spanish economy, which is not so dependent as others from Russia or Ukraine. But beyond this mitigation, short-term shock reaction, we need to continue to pursue our midterm program, which should enable the country to continue to be one of the engines of growth in Europe going forward.
Thank you, Vice President. Switching a little bit with your hat as Minister of Digitalization as well as Minister of the Economy. One thing that is being talked about a lot around these spring meetings when we get away from the obvious overwhelming issue is the role of central bank digital currencies potentially and the role of private cyber currencies. Obviously, any decisions about central bank digital currencies will be undertaken at a Euro area level with regard to Spain, and presumably regulation of cyber currencies would take place at a European level. Nonetheless, you are one of the responsible ministers in the European leadership on these issues. What do you see as the use case or the potential utility or risks of central bank digital currencies? Do you want a digital euro out there? To what end? And is this a moment when there might be or should be a cleanup of some of the private cyber currencies when there are questions about whether they are going to become a means of evading sanctions, or maybe that's part of their value proposition that they become a means of evading sanctions? So as Minister for Digitalization, how do you see these issues, please?
Well, that's a very interesting question because I have seen a change in the 4 years that I am a minister with regards to both issues. With regards to cyber currencies and crypto assets, in the first meetings we had of the G20, there was a curiosity. It was considered to be something that was developing, but not so much of an issue. there were growing concerns in the course of these 4 years about these instruments being used or very directly related to money laundering, terrorism financing. And I have seen a change of attitude in many jurisdictions. Well, you have seen the decisions that have been taken in some jurisdictions in this regard. So no doubt about it, regulation should be at the minimum European, but most, preferably global. And I am sure we will be discussing this in this meeting. Maybe these weeks is going to be captured by other priorities, as you mentioned. But this is definitely an issue that is in the international agenda and that will be tackled. At the European level, there is ongoing legislation being prepared, and some member states, including Spain, have been already acting to try to at least deal with the most obvious risk, which is one of abuse, client abuse. These kind of advertisements and investments are being targeted at younger persons and not professional investors, and that can certainly be an issue that we need to be looking into, amongst others. No? So I am quite sure that there will be regulation of cryptocurrencies and cyber and crypto assets more broadly, and I think it should be coordinated at global level. And likewise on central bank digital currencies, 4 years ago, it was considered to be something not very relevant, not really a priority, whereas now the European Central Bank is working on this, as many other central banks around the world. And I think that something will come of it. It will take time. This is not something that will take a month just to become a reality. But it is also true that the financial sector is one of the sectors that's being most affected by digitalization. We're seeing it in the retail markets, and obviously wholesale markets, it probably happened before. So this is an area that cannot escape or cannot pretend to continue to develop as if digitalization was not a relevant element affecting monetary policy, amongst others. So I think it is very good that the central banks are looking into it, and coordination in this regard will also be necessary between the central banks throughout the world.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Continuing on this area between international relations and digitalization, obviously part of the backdrop for the meetings this week in Washington is not just the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the increasing tensions between China and the US and how those are being felt through the international financial institutions and discussions. I'm obviously not going to ask you to comment directly on that. That's for foreign ministers. What I would like to ask you about is what in, say, the digital area or in terms of financial stability would you worry about a US-China division affecting? What should be the role of Europe or the IMFC to try to keep things maybe not level playing field or integrated internationally, but to mitigate the effects of a China-US separation in these spheres of digital and finance?
Well, you're right to pose this question to a European, because the EU is a trade powerhouse. And this is, the EU was built on the basis of a tariff union, and trade has been one of the driving forces for the prosperity of the EU. And I think it is the largest trading partner throughout the world. And trade and globalization has provided the world with incredible growth and prosperity, and hundreds of millions of citizens throughout the world have exited poverty thanks to this process. I think it would be the trend towards more shorter supply chains was already there before the pandemic, but it has certainly been accelerated due to the pandemic, because we suddenly realized how vulnerable we were, be it in the supply of masks protective gear, be it in the supply of vaccines, and then semiconductors. And now we're seeing that with regards to energy. So it is a trend that certainly is there. Will probably be accelerated also as a consequence of the attack on Ukraine and geopolitical challenges. But it is regrettable, because diversification of sources and also international trade has proven to be a formidable engine for growth and prosperity, and also bringing peoples and companies and economies together is also a way to make them stronger, interlinked, and maybe build a more global approach to issues. I hope that we are able to preserve these elements. At least this is surely going to be the approach that we take in the meetings in a challenging time also from this point of view.
Speaking as someone who is a huge fan of globalization and Europe in the very terms you say, thank you for those remarks. And I hope that does the European voice and the other voices in favor of that approach and that value on globalization is there. We had the privilege yesterday to host Lawrence Wong, the finance minister of Singapore, who asked similar questions, made a similar plea or argument. And anyway, it's good to have these voices out there. We're coming to the end of our time, and you've been very generous with your thoughtful answers and your openness to questions, Vice President. I'd like to end with one slightly speculative note or question. We get repeated comments in the financial press, in markets, occasionally in political press, about the sanctions and this time of conflict being a moment when the dollar might recede as a global reserve currency, particularly if it is part of sanctions that expropriate individuals or lock up a central bank's reserves. We were fortunate to have remarks yesterday by U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary Adeyemo, in which, of course, I think well, but as part of his job, he says that's nonsense. How do you see the issue of the dollar's role going forward following sanctions? Do you see the euro taking on a bigger role, particularly with, as you mentioned, the next generation EU funds, not only funding a more viable European economy, but as our former colleague Jerman Zettelmeyer has written about, creating additional safe assets that are denominated in euros if more debt is issued. So how do you see Europe's role or the euro's role in the international reserves going forward?
Well, I two issues, and this is a delicate political question, because, or you put me in a diplomatic hotspot, because we have been for years arguing on the need to reinforce the international role of the euro. So indeed, that is an objective that we do have. I think that being the second currency in the world obviously is a good place to be, and we need to continue to go in that direction. And so that is an objective that the EU would have. At the same time, I think that the role of the dollar is as a reserve currency and as a reference currency is there. I do not think that the current sanctions in themselves can endanger that role, and I think there should be space for more than one in terms of a growing economy. Again, these currencies have been instrumental to the growth of trade and globalization and prosperity throughout the world, and so I think that there should be a possibility for the dollar and also the euro to be important currencies going forward.
Very diplomatically handled, but also very much consonant with the economic research we can have more than one reserve currency, as you know. Whether we will is another question. But thank you very much on behalf of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and our global audience listening today and watching you in the future. We are very grateful to you for taking time out of this incredibly busy week for you to speak with us, to graciously answer our questions. And we wish you the best of success. Ladies and gentlemen, Nadia Calviño, the Vice President of Spain, the Minister for Economy and Digitalization for Spain, and the Chair of the IMFC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, and looking forward to seeing you in person soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.